The world believed Princess Diana's fortune would vanish into the royal vault after her death. They were wrong. When executors unsealed her will in 1997,
a prince needed a wife. The machinery of the monarchy had been scanning the landscape for the right candidate, and Diana Spencer, the quiet girl from Sandringham who had spent her whole life feeling like she was not enough, had just appeared on the list. She had no idea what was coming. There was a tunnel in Paris. A black Mercedes moving fast through the night. Camera flashes exploding like lightning in the dark. A concrete pillar. A silence that swallowed the entire world. And then she was gone. But here is what nobody told you. That night in Paris was not where this story begins. This story begins 7 days before Diana had a name. 7 days of silence. 7 days of a family that looked at a baby girl and felt nothing but disappointment.
We all remember Lady Diana Spencer, who later became Diana, Princess of Wales, the first wife of Prince Charles. Diana died tragically 22 years ago in 1997 from injuries sustained in a car crash in Paris.
She was born on July 1, 1961, at Park House in Sandringham, Norfolk. A 10-bedroom estate sitting directly on the grounds of Queen Elizabeth's private royal retreat. Her neighbors were princes. Her family had titles stretching back centuries. From the outside, it looked like the most privileged beginning a child could ever be given. From the inside, it was already broken. Her parents, John and Frances Spencer, had not been waiting for a daughter. They had been waiting for a son. A year before Diana arrived, they had lost a baby boy named John, who lived only hours after birth. The grief of that loss had not faded. It had curdled into pressure, into desperation, into a very specific kind of hope that Diana's arrival immediately destroyed. So they said nothing. Named her nothing. For 7 full days, she existed in a house where no one celebrated her. Hi viewers, I want to ask you something personal. When you were growing up, did you ever feel like you were never quite enough for your family? Drop a yes or no in the comments right now. When they finally settled on a name, they chose Diana Frances. Frances, after her mother. Diana, borrowed from a distant Spencer relative who had herself once been considered a potential Princess of Wales. A woman who had come close, but never quite arrived. They named her after women who almost made it. And from the very first week of her life, that was already her story. Close enough to matter. Never quite enough to be chosen. And yet, if you had driven past Park House in those early years and peered through the gates, you would have seen something that looked like a fairy tale. Diana playing with Prince Andrew and Prince Edward on the lawns. Calling Queen Elizabeth Aunt Lilibet like she was any ordinary neighbor. Polo matches, country estates, formal dinners, the kind of proximity to royalty that most people spend their whole lives dreaming about. But proximity to power is not the same as being protected by it.
4 years before she died, she signed a last will and testament and modified that will the year before she died. In those documents, she left her estate worth approximately $25 million to her 2 sons, and 1/4 of her chattels, which consist of personal property, to her 17 godchildren.
She was 7 years old when the ground beneath her finally gave way completely. Her parents' marriage had been rotting for years, and in 1967, it collapsed. Her mother Frances walked out. What followed was not just a separation. It was a war. A custody battle so ugly that Diana's own paternal grandmother took the stand in court and testified against her own daughter to help ensure Diana's father would win the children. Think about that for a moment. Her own grandmother. Diana's father won. And Diana stood outside Park House and listened to the sound of her mother's car disappearing down the gravel driveway. The crunch of tires on stone growing fainter and fainter until there was nothing left. She never forgot that sound. She carried it with her everywhere she went after that. Into every room. Every relationship. Every moment where someone she trusted chose something else over her.
Now, you might think that Diana's wishes would be carried out to the letter, and that would be the end of the matter. But it turned out that the executors of Diana's estate asked and received from a probate court in England a variance to her will. That meant that instead of giving 1/4 of the value of her personal property to her godchildren, as specifically stated, each child received one and only one item from Diana's estate.
In 1975, her father inherited the title of Earl Spencer. The family moved from Park House to Althorpe, the Spencer ancestral seat in Northamptonshire. Grand stone walls. Portraits of ancestors going back generations. A house that looked like history itself had been carved into its foundations. It felt like a tomb. And then in 1976, her father remarried. Her new stepmother was Rain, the Countess of Dartmouth, and Diana did not simply dislike her. She loathed her with a quiet, burning intensity. She saw Rain as an invader. Someone who had walked into their grief and rearranged the furniture. The tension between them was constant, raw, and completely unresolved. It got so severe that on one occasion, Diana pushed Rain down a flight of stairs. This shy, soft-spoken girl had a furnace inside her. She was learning something early. Something the palace would one day deeply regret teaching her. That when a system tries to reduce you, when it tries to decide who you are before you ever get to choose, you find a way to push back. School was no escape either. She failed her O-levels twice. Changed schools more than once. Drifted through the academic world without ever quite landing anywhere. But the teachers who paid attention noticed something in her that no examination could ever measure. She had warmth. Real warmth. The kind that could not be performed or rehearsed. She won a school award for community spirit. While other girls her age were focused on social lives, Diana was volunteering at psychiatric hospitals. She was scrubbing floors as a cleaner. She was showing up for people who had nothing to offer her in return. That was always who she was. In 1979, with help from her mother, she purchased a small flat at Coleherne Court in Earl's Court, London. A birthday gift. She was 18 years old. She moved in with 3 flatmates. She drove an old, unremarkable car through the streets of the city. She taught dance to children. She worked as a nanny. She cleaned houses. For the first time in her entire life, something felt right. No custody battles echoing through the walls. No cold stepmother rearranging the home. No grand estate hiding a broken family behind ancient stone. Just a small flat, good friends, ordinary days, and a life that was entirely and completely her own. She was happy. Genuinely, quietly, deeply happy. The kind of happiness she had spent every single year of her childhood searching for without ever finding. And then the palace noticed her. She had no idea that the happiness she had finally found in that small London flat was about to be the last uncomplicated thing she would feel for a very long time. She was 19 years old when a prince first looked at her and decided she might be useful. Not loved. Not chosen in the way a person deserves to be chosen. Useful. There is a difference, and Diana would spend the next decade of her life learning exactly how sharp that difference could be. His name was Charles Philip Arthur George. The Prince of Wales. Heir to the British throne. A man who had been groomed since the moment of his birth to understand that his life was not entirely his own. He was 31 years old when he met Diana Spencer properly at a house party in the summer of 1980. He was looking for a wife. Not a companion. Not a partner. A wife in the very specific, very institutional sense of the word. Someone young enough to be malleable. Someone with no history. Someone who had never belonged to anyone else. Diana fit every requirement on the checklist. She was 19. She was aristocratic. She was a virgin, which the palace actually confirmed through what can only be described as the most dehumanizing vetting process imaginable. She had no past relationships that could become newspaper headlines. She had no opinions that had ever made anyone uncomfortable. She was, from a distance, exactly what they needed. But here is what they missed. Diana was not a blank page. She was a girl who had watched her mother drive away and never stopped waiting for people to leave.
The godchildren got what some referred to as tacky mementos, while Diana's important and priceless personal property, including her collection of dresses and letters, family paintings, home movies, scores and lyrics from Elton John's tribute song, and lots more, were held by Diana's brother, who loaned the collection to museums around the world.
She was someone who had spent years making herself smaller to survive, who had learned to read rooms the way other people read books, who carried a furnace of feeling inside her that had never once been given a safe place to burn. She was not empty. She was full. She was a dam, and nobody at the palace thought to check whether the walls were holding. The courtship was fast. Too fast. Charles had been seen publicly with several women before Diana, most notably Camilla Shand, who had married Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973. That relationship had never fully ended, not in the way endings are supposed to work. It had simply paused, changed shape, settled into something quieter and more permanent than anyone was willing to name out loud. Diana knew about Camilla. She was 19, not naive. But she told herself it was the past. She told herself she had won. She told herself that when a man asks you to be his wife, it means something. Charles proposed on February 6, 1981. He took her aside at Windsor Castle and asked her to marry him. Diana later recalled that she laughed. Not from happiness. From nerves. From the sheer weight of the moment landing on a girl who had spent her whole life being told she was not quite enough and was now being handed the title of future Queen of England. She said yes. And then something happened that she would never forget for the rest of her life. She said she loved him. And Charles said, in return, whatever love means. Whatever love means. Think about those 3 words for a moment. Think about what it feels like to offer your heart to someone and have them respond with a philosophy question. She was 19 years old. She had said yes to marrying him. She had just agreed to leave her entire life behind. And the man who was about to become her husband looked at her and said whatever love means. She filed it away. The way she had learned to file things away. The way she had been doing it since she was 7 years old, standing outside Park House listening to her mother's car disappear. The engagement was announced on February 24, 1981. The world erupted. Diana became, almost overnight, the most photographed person on the planet. Cameras followed her everywhere. The press called her Shy Di. They made her into a symbol of innocence, of hope, of everything a fairy tale princess was supposed to be. Young women across the world cut their hair to match hers. Children named their dolls after her. The machinery of public adoration swallowed her whole before she had ever even walked down an aisle. But inside the palace walls, she was already unraveling. Almost immediately after the engagement, the real loneliness began. Charles was older, established in his routines, surrounded by people who had known him for decades. Diana was a teenager dropped into a world of ancient protocol where nothing was explained and everything was expected. She moved into Clarence House, then Buckingham Palace, and found herself spending hours alone in rooms so large they had their own echo. She cried constantly. Not dramatic crying. Quiet crying. The kind that comes when there is nothing left to do but feel the weight of where you have landed. Staff members described her as lost. As frightened. As someone who seemed to be searching for a door that had somehow already been locked behind her. And then it got worse. She learned that Charles was still in contact with Camilla Parker Bowles. Not rumors. Evidence. Phone calls. Letters. A bracelet that Charles had commissioned for Camilla with the initials GF engraved on it. GF. Standing for Girl Friday, a private name between them that Diana was never meant to know about. She found out anyway. She confronted Charles. He dismissed her concerns. She went to his family for support and was gently turned away.
Exhibitions of the Princess Diana collection raised millions of dollars for charities, but the heirs who were to receive a quarter of that property got none of it. In the end, the godchildren received essentially nothing of value.
She was 20 years old by this point and already experiencing what a therapist would recognize as the early symptoms of serious mental distress. She was struggling with food. She was struggling with sleep. She was struggling with the sensation that she had walked through a beautiful door into a room that had no windows and no way out. The wedding was set for July 29, 1981. Planning was already underway on a scale that had never been attempted in modern British history. The dress, the carriages, the crowds, the global television audience that would eventually number 750 million people. 750 million people watching a 20-year-old girl walk toward a marriage that was already, from the inside, in serious trouble. She went through with it anyway. Because she had always gone through with things. Because she had been taught from childhood that you close your eyes and endure. Because the car with her mother in it drove away and you stand on the driveway and watch until there is nothing left to watch and then you go back inside and carry on. The night before the wedding, Diana wept. She told friends she had serious doubts. They told her it was too late. The carriage was already ordered. The world was already watching. There was no road back from where she was standing. So she put on the dress. A cream silk taffeta gown with a 25-foot train. The most famous piece of clothing in the world. And she climbed into the carriage, and she rode through streets lined with 1 million people who were screaming her name, and she stepped out at St. Paul's Cathedral, and she walked toward the altar. Whatever love means. She repeated his vows in the wrong order during the ceremony. She called him Philip Charles instead of Charles Philip. A small slip. A tiny crack in the performance. Most people assumed it was nerves. It was. But not the kind they imagined. The fairy tale the world was watching had already begun to fracture before the flowers had even had a chance to wilt. The honeymoon lasted 14 days. On the royal yacht Britannia, sailing through the Mediterranean, Diana discovered something that would haunt her every day that followed. She found photographs of Camilla Parker Bowles tucked inside Charles's diary. Personal photographs. The kind you keep because you cannot bear to be without them. And when she confronted him, he did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply looked at her with that same steady, unreachable calm that she would learn to dread above almost anything else. They had been married less than 3 weeks. She was 20 years old on a boat in the Mediterranean with a husband who kept photographs of another woman next to his most private thoughts, and there was nowhere to go. Literally nowhere. She was on a yacht in the middle of an ocean with a man who made her feel, more than she had ever felt before in her life, entirely and completely alone. When they returned to Britain, the performance began in earnest. And it was a performance. That is the word that belongs here. Not a marriage. A performance of a marriage, staged for a public that had invested everything in the belief that this love was real. 2 residences, Highgrove in Gloucestershire and the Kensington Palace Apartments in London. 2 lives that increasingly ran on parallel tracks and almost never met in the middle. Charles had his friends, his pursuits, his horses, his painting, his deep and abiding passion for architecture and organic farming, and the kind of intellectual conversation that he had never once tried to have with his wife. Diana had her apartments and her silence and the growing, gnawing knowledge that she had made the most public mistake in the history of the world. But then something happened that shifted everything. She was pregnant. Prince William Arthur Philip Louis was born on June 21, 1982. 12 months after the wedding. And when Diana held that baby, something in her rearranged itself permanently. Something that had been searching and drifting and losing itself inside palace corridors found its anchor. She became, from the moment of William's birth, a mother in a way that was so total, so fierce, so completely consuming that it seemed to be the first truly authentic thing that had happened to her since she had moved into that small flat in Earl's Court and felt the relief of an ordinary life. She insisted on being hands-on in ways that royal protocol simply did not accommodate. She wanted to bathe her son, feed him, take him to nursery herself. She was not interested in handing him over to nannies at the appointed hour and retreating to the formal world of duty and distance. She had grown up in a house where love was conditional and often absent. She was not going to replicate that. Not for anything. She broke rules. She took William on a royal tour to Australia when he was 9 months old, which had never been done before. She crouched down to meet children at eye level instead of standing over them at the stiff, composed angle that royalty had always maintained. She held people's hands. She sat with the sick and the dying and the forgotten, and she was not performing. That is the part that cannot be faked. She was genuinely there with them, in the room, in the moment, bringing something that no title or protocol had given her and no protocol could take away. The public loved her for it. Harry was born in 1984. And now she had 2 sons and a marriage that had collapsed almost entirely under its own weight, and a husband who she knew, with absolute certainty by this point, had never stopped loving someone else. Charles had quietly resumed his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana knew. The staff knew. A small, discreet circle of people knew. And the remaining piece of the fairy tale that had been keeping the whole structure upright was now load-bearing nothing. She began to reach out in ways that were desperate and ultimately very painful. She called friends in the middle of the night. She called members of Charles's circle and begged them to intercede. She made several attempts to speak to the Queen directly, to explain what was happening in the marriage, and was met with the particular kind of sympathy that powerful institutions offer when they want to acknowledge pain without doing anything about it. A look. A gentle nod. A quiet suggestion that things might improve with time. They did not improve with time. What the palace did not understand, what they would spend years not understanding, was that Diana was not a person who could simply be managed. She had tried every quiet, dignified, acceptable avenue available to her, and every one had been gently closed. And a person who has run out of quiet options does not simply disappear. She had been learning, her entire life, that the system would not protect her. She had been learning it since she was 7 and her parents' marriage was decided in a courtroom. She had been learning it in the palace, in the corridors, in the rooms where nobody explained the rules but everyone expected them to be followed. She had been learning that if you waited for institutions to do the right thing by you, you would wait forever. So she stopped waiting. She began keeping notes. Not a diary in the conventional sense. Voice recordings. Pages of memories and moments and details about what was being said and done and to whom. She was building something. An account. A record. A version of events that was entirely her own, because she had realized, by now, that if the world was ever going to know what had happened inside this marriage, someone was going to have to tell it. And there was only one person who could. She gave her first significant cooperation to a journalist named Andrew Morton in 1991. The arrangement was extraordinary in its secrecy. Diana recorded answers to questions that Morton had sent her on audio tapes, alone in her sitting room at Kensington Palace, and had the tapes smuggled out of the building. No palace official knew. No aide was present. She sat in a chair in a room in the most scrutinized residence in Britain, and she spoke the truth about her life out loud for the first time. The book that resulted, Diana, Her True Story, was published in June 1992. It detonated like a charge placed at the foundation of the monarchy. In it, Diana described her loneliness, her isolation, her struggles with mental health, her sense that the institution had failed her comprehensively. She described reaching out for help and finding no one. She described the toll of a marriage that existed in name only. She described Camilla, not by name directly, but in terms that made everything completely clear to anyone who was paying even the most basic attention. The palace reacted with fury, with disbelief, with a kind of institutional panic that comes when a structure built on controlled information suddenly has none of the control. Charles's team began working to shape a counter-narrative. Friends of the prince gave interviews. Background briefings were issued. The machinery of reputation management that had been quietly running for decades suddenly shifted into a higher, louder, more visible gear. But it was too late. Diana had spoken. And once Diana spoke, the world listened. Because the world had always been watching her. Had always seen something in her that the palace had consistently failed to see. Not a problem to be managed. Not an asset to be positioned. A person. She was a person. And she was done pretending otherwise. On December 9, 1992, Prime Minister John Major stood before the House of Commons and announced that the Prince and Princess of Wales had decided to separate. He used careful language. The separation was amicable, he said. It was described as mutually agreed upon. The word divorce was not used, because divorce carried implications for the Church of England and the line of succession that nobody in that building was prepared to address in public yet. But everyone in the room and everyone watching at home understood what was actually being said. The fairy tale was officially over. What followed was not simply the dissolution of a marriage. It was a war conducted in the pages of newspapers, in television studios, in the private offices of lawyers and spin doctors and palace officials who were all, in their various ways, trying to control a story that had long since escaped anyone's control. Both sides briefed journalists. Both sides cultivated allies in the press. Both sides had people working around the clock to make sure the other side looked worse. It was brutal. And it was public. And Diana, having spent 12 years learning how the institution worked, was considerably better at it than anyone had anticipated. She had always been underestimated. In November 1995, she gave an interview to the BBC journalist Martin Bashir that became one of the most watched pieces of television in British broadcasting history. Sitting in a chair in Kensington Palace, dressed simply, her eyes dark with shadow and her voice entirely calm, she said things that had never been said in that way by someone in her position. She said there were 3 people in the marriage. She said it directly. Without flinching. She talked about her struggles with mental health. About seeking help and not finding it. About feeling like the institution wanted her to go away quietly and how she had decided, for the first time in her life, not to go away quietly. She said she wanted to be a queen in people's hearts. Not the Queen of England with all its protocol and distance and ancient stone. The queen of something warmer. Something real. 60 million people in Britain watched that interview. 60 million people sat in their living rooms and watched a woman who had spent 15 years being defined by others refuse, on camera, to be defined by anyone but herself. The palace was not simply displeased. The palace was, in the truest sense of the word, destabilized. Because the problem with Diana was not her behavior. The problem was that the public believed her. The public had always believed her. Even when Charles gave his own television interview and admitted to his relationship with Camilla in 1994, the sympathy had not shifted toward him the way his advisors had hoped. People looked at Diana and they saw something that was very difficult to argue against. They saw someone who was telling the truth. In August 1996, the divorce was finalized. Diana lost the title of Her Royal Highness, which was a decision that came from the palace and which wounded her in ways she spoke about privately with real anguish. She kept the title Princess of Wales. She kept her apartments at Kensington Palace. She received a financial settlement worth somewhere in the range of £17 to £22 million. And she was free, in a technical, legal sense, in a way she had not been free for 15 years. But freedom is complicated when your name is the most famous name in the world. She threw herself into her work. Not charity work in the ribbon-cutting, handshaking sense that royal engagements usually implied. Real work. The kind that put her in rooms and situations that made palace officials deeply uncomfortable. She walked through active landmine fields in Angola in 1997, wearing a visor and protective gear, walking paths that organizations were trying to have cleared, and the images went everywhere. She did not do it for the cameras. She did it because she had a particular and very personal understanding of what it felt like to be surrounded by danger that other people refused to acknowledge. She campaigned with a ferocity that surprised even her closest allies. She flew to Washington and lobbied American lawmakers on the landmines issue. She visited Bosnia. She sat with people in the final stages of terrible illnesses in ways that most public figures would have organized carefully from behind glass. She was not behind glass. She was there, in the room, holding hands, carrying the weight of other people's pain the way she had always carried it. The palace watched all of this with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Because Diana without the constraints of royal protocol was more powerful than Diana with them. She had more freedom, more access, more ability to choose where she went and what she said and who she aligned herself with. She had become, in the year since the divorce, something that the institution genuinely had no framework for. Not a royal. Not a celebrity. Not a politician. Something that borrowed from all three and was ultimately none of them. She was simply herself. And the world, as it had always done, turned toward her like a compass finding north. She had started a new chapter. Genuinely, for the first time since that flat in Earl's Court with its small rooms and ordinary days, she seemed to be finding something close to contentment. She was 45 days away from her 37th birthday. She had her sons. She had her causes. She had begun a relationship with Dodi Fayed, the son of Egyptian businessman Mohammed Al-Fayed, a man who seemed to offer her the kind of uncomplicated warmth and attention she had spent so much of her life reaching toward. She was in Paris. It was August. The summer had been warm and slow and full of possibility. Her sons were with their father. She and Dodi had been on a Mediterranean yacht. They had arrived in Paris on August 30th, and the photographers had not left them alone for a single moment. Not at the hotel. Not in the streets. Not anywhere. She was used to it. She had been living inside the camera's eye for 16 years. But that night, something felt different. The attention felt more aggressive. More relentless. More like pursuit than coverage. They left the Ritz Hotel just after midnight on August 31st, 1997. The black Mercedes. The tunnel. The photographers. And then the silence. The kind of silence that swallows everything. At 4 o'clock in the morning on August 31st, 1997, the British government was informed that Diana, Princess of Wales, had not survived. She was 36 years old. In London, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland where the royal family was staying, Prince William and Prince Harry were asleep. They were 14 and 12 years old. They would not be told until morning. Their father, Prince Charles, received the news in the deep hours before dawn, and the task of waking his sons fell to him alone in a way that no protocol could have ever prepared anyone for. Just stop here for a moment. A 14-year-old boy. A 12-year-old boy. Their father walking into their rooms in the early morning light to tell them that their mother was gone. Whatever happened in those rooms, whatever was said, has never been spoken about publicly by any of them in any meaningful detail. Some things are simply too human for public language. By the time the sun rose over London that morning, the city was already changing. It is difficult, looking back, to fully convey what the days that followed actually felt like. The grief was not polite. It was not contained. It spilled out of people in ways that the British cultural tradition of reserved emotion had never really seen before and has not quite seen since. Hundreds of thousands of people came to Kensington Palace and placed flowers outside the gates until the flowers became a carpet, then a field, then a mountain of color that stretched as far as you could see. People wept openly in the streets. People who had never met her, who had only ever known her through a television screen, stood in public places and cried without embarrassment. The grief was personal. That was the thing. It should not have been personal, by any rational measure. She was a famous woman they had watched from a distance. But the people who came to those gates, who laid those flowers, who stood in silence with tears running down their faces, they did not feel like they had lost a celebrity. They felt like they had lost someone who understood them. Someone who had sat in the dark places of her own life and had somehow made the dark places feel less frightening for everyone watching. She had a gift. It was not a performed gift. It was not strategic. It was the ability to make people feel seen at a time when the institutions and structures designed to see them had consistently looked away. The royal family remained at Balmoral in the days after her death, and the silence from the palace became, very quickly, its own kind of crisis. The flag at Buckingham Palace did not fly at half-mast. There was no public statement of grief from the Queen in those first days. The calculation, apparently, was one of protocol, of precedent, of the usual way things were done. But the public was not in the mood for the usual way things were done. They were furious. For a brief, extraordinary period, the grief flipped into something closer to anger. Newspapers ran front pages that asked, essentially, where is the Queen? People left notes among the flowers that expressed, in terms that were not remotely diplomatic, how they felt about the institution that had, in their view, failed Diana in life and was now failing to properly honor her in death. The palace eventually responded. The flag went to half-mast. The Queen returned to London and gave a televised address, calling Diana an exceptional and gifted human being, and acknowledged that she spoke as a grandmother, a human being, before she spoke as a monarch. It was the right thing to say. But it had taken 5 days to say it. On September 6, 1997, Diana's funeral was held at Westminster Abbey. 1.5 million people lined the streets of London. 2.5 billion people watched on television around the world. Her sons, 14-year-old William and 12-year-old Harry, walked behind the coffin through those streets. Their uncle Charles Spencer walked with them. Their father walked with them. Prince Philip walked with them. And behind the glass of every window, inside every building they passed, people were silent. Her brother Charles Spencer delivered a eulogy that remains one of the most extraordinary pieces of public language of the 20th century. He said Diana was the most hunted person of the modern age. He spoke directly to William and Harry and promised that their mother's blood family, the Spencers, would work to ensure her boys were not simply swallowed up by duty and protocol but were allowed to grow into men with freedom, imagination, and compassion. He spoke those words in an abbey full of the establishment. And when he finished, the applause from the crowds outside began, and it rolled through the open doors and filled the building, and the people inside applauded too, and the Queen sat in her pew and the sound washed over her. Her body was returned to Althorpe, the Spencer family estate. She was buried on a small island in the grounds, surrounded by water, in a place that was private and quiet and entirely separate from the world that had consumed her. She had wanted, more than almost anything, to simply be left alone to love her boys and do her work and live inside a life that was actually hers. She had wanted the small flat in Earl's Court and the ordinary days and the freedom that comes when no one is watching. She never quite got it. But she had found something else along the way. Something that no institution had given her and no institution could take away. She had found herself. The girl named after women who almost made it turned out to be the one who made it furthest of all. Not in the way the palace had intended. Not in a crown or a title or a seat at the formal table. In something harder to measure and impossible to erase. She made it into the rooms where people were most alone with their pain, and she sat down beside them. She made it into the hearts of people who had never had a reason to care about royalty before and found, in her, a reason they could not explain but could not stop feeling. She died at 36. She had lived, in the truest sense, for about 18 of those years. The first half spent shrinking herself to fit spaces that were not built for her. The second half spent learning, slowly and at enormous personal cost, that she did not have to shrink at all. That is the thing about Diana that the palace never understood. They thought her power came from her proximity to them. They thought her value was her association with the institution. They thought they had made her. They had not made her. She had made herself. Out of the silence of a 7-day wait for a name. Out of gravel driveways and custody battles and school failures and loneliness and a marriage that started with whatever love means. Out of all of it. Every last piece of it. She had built herself from the rubble they handed her, and she had walked into the world and she had changed it. She changed it. And there is something about the story that you think you already know, something about what happened in that Paris tunnel, that the official record still has not fully answered. Something about the motorcycles. Something about the timing. Something about who knew what and when they knew it, and what exactly was being protected in those final hours before the Mercedes entered the underpass. The investigation said accident. The inquests reached their conclusions. The files were closed. But if you know where to look, if you know what questions to ask, if you sit with the details long enough, something does not sit still. Come back for the next video. Because what you are about to hear is not the version they put in the history books. It is the version they spent a very long time hoping you would never think to ask about.